I'm going to back up a little bit. And we had been gone through a chapter in 6, and this is where Paul was making a commendation about his ministry. And one of the commentators made an interesting look at the way he set up those verses. But before we get any further, I think I'll open us with prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for who you are. Thank you for your mercy and grace and your gift of your Son so we can be found to be justified and righteous. Be with all of us as we try to understand your word. Be with all of us that need your healing hand. Open our hearts and our minds to your message. In your Son's name I pray. Amen. So, what I'm talking about is going back to 6:6 and then on to the end of that section, which is 6:10, where Paul was making some commendation about himself. And so, this is going to be a very GT question. So I want you to listen to this and tell me where this pattern or where these thoughts come from. And the hint will be it's not Paul. That's probably he took it from somebody else. 6:4 to 5. In troubles, hardships, and distresses, and beatings, imprisonments, and riots. 6:6 in purity. 6:8 to glory and dishonor, bad report and good report, genuine yet regarded as impossible. 6:10 sorrowful yet always rejoicing. 6:10 poor yet making many rich, having nothing yet possessing everything. Where did we hear this? And from who did we hear something similar to this? This is a real GT question. I hadn't thought about it until I read the commentary, so nobody gets it. Who else said something like this?
The Beatitudes?
Yes. Yay! Exactly. This is, again, from Matthew. 6:4, 5, in troubles, hardships, and distresses. Blessed are those persecuted for righteousness' sake. Matthew 5:10. In purity. Blessed are the pure in heart. Matthew 5:8. To glory and dishonor, bad report and good report, genuine yet regarded as impostor. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say things of evil against you because of me. This is Matthew 5:11. Sorrowful yet always rejoicing. Blessed are those who mourn. Matthew 5:4. Poor yet making many rich. Blessed are the poor. Matthew 5:3. And so, this is the pattern of Jesus speaking. And so, obviously, to me, Paul knew this. We don't think that Matthew had written his gospel yet, but obviously the Christians knew and remembered what Jesus had said. So he's basically patterning after my GT person back there figured it out, the Beatitudes. I'm impressed, because I didn't get it until I read the commentator report on this. Now we'll go on to who Christians are and who they are not. That's 6:11 to 13. This is a section, that remember that many people, especially in the last century or two, spent a lot of time tearing apart the gospel, especially the New Testament, especially Paul's letters, looking for what they consider inconsistencies, and this is one where a while back, people really thought that there was a problem with this section. And the problem with this section is that he suddenly changes what he's talking about. And he suddenly, he's been going along asking the Corinthians to reconcile with them, and suddenly he changes his focus. And then when he ends this section, the thoughts that go on after that seem to match the ending of the last section. And so that, there was controversy about what, did somebody insert this next section into the letter, and why? It went around and around for quite a while, but basically the modern thought is, no, this is just the way Paul often did things. That he had a digression. Remember, this is a letter. This is kind of him, like we're talking, and we all have digressions. And that there's no good reason why anybody would insert this in here. Our earliest manuscripts of this letter all have this in it. And so it's, some of you saw a very wonderful video that Pastor Shane showed, and I think Pastor Mark still has, talking about some of these inconsistencies. And basically, the modern thought is this is just a digression that Paul had. While some of the other reasons they thought it was different is he used some words he doesn't use elsewhere, but he does that all through his letters. Every once in a while he'll throw in a new word. He also will have a series of quotations from the Old Testament to make his point. But he did that in a number of other letters too. And so most modern commentators do not feel that this is anything but just a digression that Paul had in his letter. And so we will, most people feel this is really Paul. It's not somebody else putting things in, or that they took this section from another letter and stuck it in. But this is just a digression that he has. Anyway. We'll go ahead with 6:11, Dennis, please.
We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians, open wide our hearts to you.
We have spoken freely to you. And the Greek is, our mouths stand open. And that was a metaphor or idiom that they used to say that what we're speaking freely, what I'm saying is true. It's him saying that I am open and have free conversations with you. What I'm saying is not hidden or deceitful, is what he's trying to say there. What would we say? What would our idiom kind of mean the same thing?
Is it like being transparent?
Yes. Nowadays, the modern thing is I'm transparent with you. I'm not hiding anything from you. I'm not being deceitful or underhanded with you. And so our modern vocabulary, at least the last decade or so, is transparency. And so he's saying, I'm being transparent with you. I'm open with you. I'm talking freely with you, like we would talk with friends. And he also said, open our hearts to you. What does that mean that you have opened your hearts to somebody?
You care for somebody.
You care for somebody. He loves them. He has always loved them. So good part of this letter, good part of 1 Corinthians is he's correcting them. He's correcting them in a loving way, and he's correcting them as a parent to a child. Just because you correct your child or your grandchild, does that mean that you don't love them? So when the girls come over and you have to fuss at them, Larry, does that mean that you don't love them?
I don't love the behavior.
You don't love their behavior. Yeah, that's a good way to say it. You don't love their behavior, but you love them. And so pretty much that's what Paul has been saying. I love you, but I don't like some of these things you've been doing. And we've gone through 1 Corinthians and some of 2 Corinthians, and he obviously sent that sorrowful letter where he's correcting them just like a parent should be correcting a child whose behavior is bad, but doesn't mean he doesn't love them. In the Greek, this is in the perfect tense, which means it's continuing behavior. It's not something that happened once. We don't have those tenses in English. And so what he's saying to them is, my love to you and my openness to you is continuing. It's always going to be there. It's not a conditional situation. It's only going to be good for, how long our coupon lasts. So this is something that's an ongoing condition, that he is going to continue to love them. We have trouble actually saying that kind of thing in English, but that's what the Greek does. 12, please, Larry.
We're not withholding our affection from you. You're withholding yours from us.
And so he gets to the meat of this. I'm not withholding my affection to you. You've been withholding it from me. And what had happened, remember, is that he had gone back to Corinth after his first letter, what we have in 1 Corinthians, had not been received well. And he had gone there to try to correct things, and so whoever was causing trouble, and he never really names who it was, still had trouble with Paul, and he felt the congregation had not supported him, and he had left to go back to Ephesus. And so that's what he's referring to. I still have affection for you, but you have withheld your affection from me. Lance?
As a fair exchange, I speak to my children, open wide your hearts also.
As a fair exchange. The same recompense. When you have friendship with somebody, what kind of exchange do you have with them? When you have love for somebody, what kind of exchange do you have with them?
Positive.
Positive? Yeah. Loving.
Kindness.
And so if I care for somebody and I give them something, what do I expect back?
The same.
The same thing. There's a reciprocity in that kind of relationship. And so if I have given you, in this case Paul has given him his love in the gospel, he expects something back from that. And so if you have a true relationship like that, there's a reciprocity, the equal giving back and forth, the Latin quid pro quo. And so he's expecting something back from them because what he gave them. This is really a key ingredient in any friendship, any relationship. There is a reciprocity. If you don't have somewhat of equal relationship, it's really hard to continue the friendship. Now, it doesn't always mean that one person gives monetarily the same amount into that friendship, but the friendship should be responded to. And so if I'm always reaching out to somebody and they're never, it's not going to continue as a friendship. No. You know, so it doesn't always mean the reciprocity has to be things of the world, but it's things of the spirit, things of friendship. And so without that equal sharing, it's hard to have a relationship that continues. I speak as to my children. Why would he consider them his children?
Like spiritual children.
Yeah, they're his spiritual children. They're spiritual children. And this is actually a kind of soft way of saying it. What would be the harder way of saying this? I speak to you as children. So he's not saying that they are children in the sense of that. He's saying that they're his children. I think most of us have children that are now adults, but they're still our children. We speak to them as our child, but we don't speak to them as a child. So this is a kind of a nice way of saying what he's saying. You know, I'm not talking to you that you're a child. I'm talking to you that you're my child. Does that make any sense? You know, all of us that have adult children hopefully speak to them adult to adult, but as a parent to a child. And so that is what he's trying to get across. But he's again asking them to open their hearts. That is, respond to him as he has responded to them. Okay, now it's going to be a little bit difficult. 14, please.
Warning against idolatry. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers, for what righteousness and wickedness have in common, or what fellowship can light have with darkness.
The trouble is the word that we translate as yoke. And that's where we have a problem in that it literally in the Greek means unequal yoked. And if you were pulling a plow, where most of the people here would be agricultural, they would often have two animals yoked together. There would be a system of basically, if it was oxen, wooden collars that would go over the animals and then go to the plow so that they would pull the plow. And so that's what we mean by yoked. You know, you're attached to something. And what it's saying is that the easiest definition of what's going on here is unequal yoking. What would be the problem with unequal yoking?
Conflict?
Conflict. And you can kind of think of it in the way of, say, if you had an oxen and a horse trying to match a pair. Would that work real well? No, it would not work real well. And so you had to have, whatever you were putting together had to have be somewhat similar for that to work well.
The family system is different.
Exactly. And so that's what he's getting to. He's using this as an example that they would understand. They would know that you would not put an ox and a horse and a pair and expect it to work. It's something they would need. Ultimately, he's getting to what Lynn is saying, that they had, different, in this case, religious ideas, and they would not work well together.
So do you think he's talking about mostly marital relationships or secular associations, like don't go in business with somebody who's not a believer, or don't be married with somebody who's not a believer? I guess presuming that you weren't already married when you became a believer.
That's, an argument about what he's actually talking about is what Tim is getting at. What is he talking about? You don't, unequal yoking. Marriage is one you might think about. But are there other things that you wouldn't want to do with somebody who's an unbeliever?
Or if you're in a close relationship, like besides a marriage, like it could be a business that you share together.
Yeah, so most, there's a whole list of all the possibilities, but most commentators feel that this is a general recommendation, that you should not be in a business relationship, you should not be in certain other relationships. During the beginning of all this, in 1 Corinthians, is Paul's talking about how the Corinthians had to deal with their secular world, how to deal with the idol worship, the eating of foods from that were sacrificed to those idols, how to deal with certain situations like this. Remember from 1 Corinthians, he didn't say that you should not marry an unbeliever. He talks about how to deal with this, hoping that would bring that person to. So it's not just to be marital. It's not to be more of a general. You should not become in a business relationship, because at this time, the time of Corinth that he's talking about, all those business relationships were wrapped up in some cult. That most of those things that we would consider purely secular now, like a business relationship, had some religious overtone. They were usually set in a idol worshiping temple where they would meet, where the social groups would meet. This is from 1 Corinthians. And so it's most likely felt that he's talking about things in general. That it's interesting that Paul had set up Corinth church and the Thessalonian church about the same time. Maybe one day we'll look at that letter. But the Thessalonians were dealing with considerable outside persecution. We don't hear any of that in the letters to Corinth. Obviously the Corinthians still interacted without a whole lot of trouble with the non-believers in Corinth. And so they were persecuted, but they were probably, in Paul's view, still too attached with the paganness of the society at that time. But what is he really saying? Is he saying we shouldn't do anything with non-believers?
No, I don't think so. I think because they had an example of that with the Pharisees, you know, like, you can take it to an extreme.
Right.
Pharisees didn't have anything to do with Samaritans. They didn't, you know, all these unclean people, they just kind of separated themselves from them. You know, and obviously he didn't want Christians to be that way. He wanted them to communicate with friends and neighbors and to spread the gospel, which I don't think the Pharisees and the Sadducees had any interest in doing.
Exactly right, and that's what my commentators talk about, how the Pharisees did what you just said, isolated them. And Paul didn't want them to cut themselves off completely for society. Partly, as Tim said, is he still wanted them to spread the gospel to them. So if Lynn had a shop and she wasn't a believer, it didn't preclude me from going and buying something from her shop. He doesn't want me to get into a close relationship with her. I'm using you as an example. But he didn't say that I should not do anything at all with you. He didn't want to get into a tight situation with them. Because the problem back then that we don't really have now is the way that they looked at their religion, the ones that were not Christians. Our belief is that we have an exclusive God and we are exclusively with God. That's not what they believed. That's not how they acted. And so that was a complete, become a Christian and have that inclusiveness with something very different, a completely different mindset. Because you could go to all different one of these idols and there is no jealousy, you might say, about doing that. In fact, it was considered the norm. And so, you know, if so going to, Temple A one week and Temple B and Temple C didn't mean that you had given up on A, B, or anything else, that you could do that. In fact, that was considered the norm. And so this is partly what's coming out of it. We don't really have that directly. We have more people, or rather than going to different temples, are just either Christians or more secular. At least that's my view. And so that's partly what's coming out of it. And so there's no inclusivity of their belief. They could go to Temple of Jews, Jupiter, Zeus, one day, and the next day they could go to Aphrodite or Venus, and on and on and on like that. How do we feel about that? Now, can we do that? Can we go one day to truly worship at a Hongunji, and the next day come here? No. We believe in an inclusivity of our relationship with God.
I think it's funny or odd that a lot of people who we come in contact with really criticize Christians for that. It's like, well, you're so exclusive. It's like, you got to do it your way. You know, I mean, we're all good people. We're all living our lives the best we can, and so we're all going to the same place. But they just don't understand the basics of the gospel. Thou shalt have no other God before me.
Yep. Yeah, I hear that all the time too, and I expect most of you have, And that's partly, it's hard for a lot of us to feel badly about ourselves. I'm a good person. I might not go to church, but God should, I kind of believe in Him. He should understand that I'm a good person and I should get a pass. and not go to hell. But that's not what our Bible tells us. And so I think a lot of us have a hard time feeling that we are sinners. You know, we really have a hard time. And so I hear that what Tim has said frequently, you know, I'm a good person, I haven't done any of the bad things in the Ten Commandments. And so why do I need forgiveness? How would you answer that? I think Tim's already actually given an answer, but how would you answer that?
Romans 3:23.
I say?
For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God.
Right. And so we all sin. And whether or not we believe it or not, we all are sinners. Some of us are bigger sinners, you might say, than others. But, you know, we all fall short. And so if we accept that, it's real easy. We all are in that category, so we're not gradated as sinner, A sinner, B sinner, C sinner. You know. We all are sinners, and so any sin separates us from God. But some people have a hard time with that.
I have a friend who always encourages me to go to one dance with her. And I used to dance as a child, you know, when I was like a teenager in school. And I really enjoyed it, and it was good exercise. But I keep saying no, and she says, why? I said, because I'm a Christian. I can't keep doing it, but it runs in my mom's family that, you know, they do bone dance, you know, hitting the drums and all that. And sometimes because it's a cultural thing, it's really hard for me, you know, to break away from that. But as a Christian, I feel like I can't do that anymore. So, you know, like I keep arguing with that person. Sorry, I'm not. No, we're all good people. I know I understand, but as a Christian, I cannot do that.
Yeah, and that's kind of the modern version of eating the food from the temples. You know, Paul was trying to deal with that kind of situation where superficially it looks okay, but there's some religious overtone with what you're doing. In this case, the bone dance, it has both a secular nowadays, but it also has an underlying religious overtone. And so what did Paul say we should do about that? Pretty much what Karen has had to do, that we should not be stumbling blocks to somebody. And so that, you know, ultimately what he ended up saying about food that was dedicated to the idols is we shouldn't eat it. You know, I might understand, and Karen might be strong enough Christian to know that I'm not going to really be worshiping when I'm doing the bond dance, but some weaker person might see that and that might pull them away from the gospel. And so I think your way of dealing with that is correct, and correct from the way that Paul ended up saying things. And so sometimes it's hard. Some things have gotten purely secular, so there's probably not a lot of religious overtone anymore. There's a common, fairly popular type of exercise that started off being somewhat religious. Anybody guess what I'm talking about? You see it all over the place. Yoga, exactly. That's become so secular, I think it would be hard to say that that's now something we shouldn't be doing. But you have to listen to what, if you're going to do yoga, what is coming out of the instructor. If it's really just mostly movement and things, it's probably okay. Because it really has morphed into more of a secular type of thing. But it started off having quite a bit of religious undertones to it. So is Tai Chi, another example. there is some religious underpinning. To be honest about it, most life has some religious undertoning in the past. Not as many people were as completely secular as they are today. So, go back to answering what Tim said. This is him probably being more general, not being specifically talking about marriage, because earlier on in 1 Corinthians, he does not say you can't marry a non-believer or divorce your unbelieving spouse, with the idea that hopefully that you would finally bring them to the gospel. But he's saying you don't want to get into a tight relationship with somebody because you cannot mix. And I guess I think I'll stop pretty soon because I promised to get people out. And we'll come back and finish this up next Sunday. You cannot mix two types of religious activities. You cannot mix, Christianity with worship of some other idol. That's what he's trying to say. So when you get to that, that's precluded. Doesn't mean you can't go and interact with the community. He wants you to get people to hear the gospel, bring them to the gospel. Because Paul didn't become a hermit. He was out in the community, out in the synagogues, preaching. And so that's what he wanted us to do. But he didn't want us to try to have a mixture of our religion. This is exclusive religion. And the answer to our friends is this is what our gospel tells us to do. At least that's my answer.
I've never been to a Buddhist funeral yet, but what do you do if you're asked to burn candles? To go up and to bow and burn incense?
I don't go up.
I don't do it.
What?
I just excuse myself. Like in our family, all the Christians go off and put what they call sacral incense.
All right, and I've gone to Catholic masses, funerals, and I don't. When they call for the communion with them, I don't go up for that either. So I'll go for recognizing whoever that person is, but I don't go up and burn the incense. I don't take the communion at Catholic funerals either. Anybody feel differently about that? You have to look at your own heart, and I think that the underlying thought you should have is this being a stumbling block to somebody. This is what Paul says. He feels that we are strong enough Christians that doing those things probably doesn't bother us, or shouldn't bother us, because we know where we're coming from, but it might bother somebody else, and he didn't want anybody not to get the gospel because of some behavior of them, and therefore that means us. Okay, so we'll stop here today and continue talking about 13 when we come back, but I'm going to ask Joy to close us with prayer, please.
Heavenly Father, thank you again for another session where we can study your word and bring to mind the requirements that you prescribe for us as Christians. We pray that you help us to remember these words, use it easily in our daily lives, so that we can give emphasis to others, as we can hear us, especially for again, the case to people who are listening to our hands. Bless the lesson to our hearts. In Jesus' name we pray.
Okay, thank you.